Hey everybody, I hope you had a great Thanksgiving and a restful last few days. I imagine a lot of you are familiar with the prepper craze out there. I can't really say I've gotten into it that much other than the survivalist shows, but I do love watching last minute preppers, like when the snowstorm hits and everybody rushes to the grocery store, it's like they become an overnight prepper or something, right? But this idea of preparedness, it has become serious business. It's no longer about like a zombie apocalypse or survivalist shows. People are intense. There are in virtually every state these like survivalist schools. There's a Prepper Camp USA in the Appalachian Mountains. There's even a convention called PrepperCon at this point. But, people are just getting more and more into stockpiling cash and food and even, as we see, ammunition. And apparently during the pandemic, toilet paper has become another one of those items to store away. Recently, I was reading this National Geographic article about kind of the history of preparedness in our country and kind of its modern uptick. And you see, back in the Great Depression, everything really difficult, and FDR, in a response to the Great Depression, he created what was known as the New Deal, which was essentially a series of programs and public work projects, financial reforms and regulations that helped Americans kind of recover from the Great Depression, but also to help prepare for the future. And of course, out of which comes Social Security. But following the Great Depression, World War II, Americans were watching people in London during the German bombardment, take cover in the underground transit tunnels. And they saw that, and so FDR created what was known as the Office of Civil Defense. And this was an agency that was formed to help create programs and emergency care for people in the event of a military attack on American soil. And so this agency went throughout the Cold War. Bomb shelters were built, duck and cover drills were run at the school. The name of that office was even changed in 1972 to become the Defense Civil Preparedness Agency. But over time, as the threat of nuclear attacks and like things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, came about, that some of these programs just almost seemed laughable, right? Like, what good does it do to duck and cover if you're in the midst of a nuclear attack? And so, under President Carter, he got rid of that agency and he formed FEMA, which was the Federal Emergency Management Agency. But in many of our own lifetimes, we've seen kind of a distrust of even programs like that, especially in the wake of Hurricane Andrew and Katrina in New Orleans. So prepping has become this thing now where people are learning how to survive on their own. Sort of the idea is, if we're going to survive a doomsday or an apocalyptic kind of event, that we got to be prepared because no one is coming to help. It is up to us. And you all, I just think our faith in Jesus Christ has something to say about that in response. You see, we do believe in an apocalyptic event, an end to all ends that will usher in a new beginning that will never end. And we do believe in being prepared, but we do not believe that we are all alone or it's all up to us. We are not doomsday preppers, but as we're saying over these next 4 weeks, as we enter this season of Advent, we are Advent preppers. Doomsday preppers are preparing for the worst case scenario, but Advent preppers are preparing for the best case scenario. This scenario in which Jesus comes back and puts things right as we have all longed for them to be made right. And so today is the beginning of that season of Advent. And Advent simply means coming. It's a time in which we wait and we prepare for the coming of Christ. In that sense, with Christmas looming, of course, we remember his first advent when God was made flesh and dwelt among us. But it's also a thing for us, those of us who have been born after that baby's coming to earth, who look to his second advent and prepare for it and prepare for him while we wait. And to be clear, we should probably just call it his final advent, because we know Jesus is among us even now via the Holy Spirit. And so this is a season of waiting and a season of preparedness. And so over the next 4 weeks, we're going to be talking about becoming Advent preppers, prepping for Advent, prepping for his coming. And it's fitting that our text today is from Mark chapter 13, because Mark chapter 13 has often been referred to as the little apocalypse. The little apocalypse. And again, for the disciple of Jesus, the biblical apocalypse is a good thing. It is a good thing because it means what we talked about last week. This conquering king will come in all of his glory, and he will bring forth justice and wholeness and renewal. It will be the beginning of a new heaven and a new earth. And so today's reading falls really in the same time frame of the story of Jesus as we've been looking at over the last 3 weeks. We're just in a different gospel. So we've been in Matthew 25, now we're in Mark 13. But this is the time period where, you remember, Jesus came in, what is known as his triumphal entry on a donkey, people putting palm branches, Hosanna the Son of David, and so Jesus went into the temple courts, and then he retreated from those temple courts, and he retreats to the Mount of Olives, what we call his Olivet Discourse, and he begins teaching his disciples. He's with Peter, James, John, and Andrew, and one of the comments they make is they're looking at these beautiful temple buildings. They're like, look how beautiful these are. But Jesus makes this comment about how the temple is going to be destroyed, which creates these questions, okay? The disciples say, okay, so number one, when will these things take place? When is this temple going to be destroyed? And then secondly, what will be the sign that these things are about to be accomplished? And in fact, in the Gospel of Matthew, it adds, what's the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And so if you read Matthew 24 and 25's account of the Olivet Discourse, or Mark 13, some of the answers that Jesus gives to these questions can become a little convoluted. Like, when is Jesus talking about the temple being destroyed and the signs of the temple being destroyed? And then when's he talking about when he's coming back and the end of all ends? But in Mark 13, in regards to the temple and it falling, Jesus essentially says, not yet. It's not going to happen yet. But then he gives this list of signs. And I'll put these up on the screen. He talks about the rise of false messiahs. He talks about wars and rumors of wars. He talks about earthquakes, famines, natural disasters. He talks about persecution from governments and family members. And he talks about the gospel being preached to all nations. Now, what's interesting about all of that is the temple was in fact destroyed in Jerusalem in 70 AD, and those Jews were forced to flee. I mean, it was in a sense an apocalyptic kind of event for those people. Really, really, really difficult time and persecution for Christians in Jerusalem and Jews. And so, but we look at these signs, we could easily say number 1 through 4 was all fulfilled by 70 AD. And we could even make a pretty good case for number 5, that the preaching to the whole world had happened as well, based on some of the things that the Apostle Paul says in his letters, and of what we know about the whole world. That in a sense it could have meant the scope of the Roman Empire, and that the gospel had in fact reached throughout the whole Roman Empire. And then Jesus goes on in verse 30, he says, truly I say, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Which, if we take that literally when he's teaching these disciples, we'd say 70 AD. These things happened. The temple was destroyed. Those signs have happened within a generation. But not everybody looks at it that way. Some people interpret it differently. And then there's this thing in verse 14 about the abomination of causes desolation and whatnot. And there was even, in fact, give you an idea of the way some have interpreted it. There was a popular one where a guy named Hal Lindsey predicted that Jesus would come back by 1988. And the reason he got there was because the Israel had gone without their independence for some 1900 years. They gained their independence in 1948, which, if you count a generation as 40 years, which he did, that would make it 1988 would be the latest that Christ came back. To which we would say a failed prediction, obviously, and there's been many failed predictions. But regardless, I think we can look at these things as fulfilled by the temple, the destruction of the temple. They were fulfilled, and and many of these things are continued to be fulfilled. I mean, we've seen these same kinds of signs happening over and over again, with maybe the exception of number 5, but with technology, we could say, we're coming a lot closer to every people groups and at least people having access to the gospel around the world. But regardless, there is a big but, as they say in verse 32, when Jesus says, but regarding the day or the hour, speaking of his advent, this advent to come, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. And so as we wait for Advent, we're looking today at another little parable. It's just a very, very short parable in this Olivet Discourse. We've been looking at these parables in Matthew 25 and over the last 3 weeks. And all these little parables we've been looking at in the Olivet Discourse that he's teaching his disciples have to do with staying awake while we wait. It's like the bridesmaids, and there was a delay in the bridegroom coming. And so these bridesmaids fell asleep, but when they awoke, they trimmed their lamps. Were they prepared? But they trimmed their lamps and they led this torchlight procession to the great feast. We looked at, Aaron talked about this a couple weeks ago, the parable of the talents. It's like a master of a house who leaves, or a man on a journey, he leaves his property to his stewards. He gives some 5 talents, some 2, some 1. What do we do with that? Are they multiplying what the Lord has given them to steward? And then we looked at last week, Jesus is going to be like a son of man that comes back as a returning king who sits on his throne and as a judge reveals what is there. And so these parables are meant to stir us toward action, you all. And so as we become Advent preppers, we're not just prepping, but we are learning how to take action in our waiting. So today's parable is it's very short. Verse 34, I want to highlight this. It says, going on a journey, this master puts his servants in charge, each with his own work, and commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. Okay, so we're living in a time, and it's easy enough to interpret, right, where Jesus is the master of the house, the servants are the disciples, and they have work to do. In fact, it says there, each with his work. And I think that phrase is really, really important, that each of us has been given, as a disciple of Jesus, work to do. Work to do. In 2020, this year, we have heard language around work and been categorized as essential and non-essential workers. So it causes people to think about their work, like, am I important or am I not important? There was an article not long ago by the Wall Street Journal. It was called, As Pandemic Slows Business, Workers Fret, Is My Job Relevant? And given the fact that 40% of the population is only considered essential workers, it leaves 60% of the population wondering, if I'm not essential, then am I important? This existential question that underlies that too is like, do I even matter? Do I matter if I don't have good work to do and purpose to fulfill? And so it's left a lot of people struggling. Over a quarter of the people that the Wall Street Journal polled for that article, over a quarter surveyed said their work wasn't particularly important or meaningful. And so what are we to make of this? And I think Jesus would say that regardless of what category the world has put you in as far as essential or non-essential in the midst of this pandemic, he would say we all still have work to do. Each of us as a disciple of Jesus has been given work to do. We don't want to be like the parable that Aaron talked about a few weeks ago, parable of the talents, in which we just bury the talent because we're considered non-essential workers. No, we all have work to do. And keep this in mind. This is so interesting that, remember, in the context here, Jesus is talking to Peter, James, John, and Andrew. And they're talking about the temple and how it's going to be destroyed. And in that very same breath, Jesus is saying, the center of religion and worship in Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. But in the same breath, he's saying, but each of you has work. Each of you has work. which I know for me is just a great encouragement. It makes me think that, what if all the church buildings in our world just went away? Would that mean that we no longer have work to do as pastors, as ministers of the gospel? Of course it wouldn't. I mean, the temple was destroyed and they had work to do. But it also should be an encouragement to you, right? I mean, if like your business goes away or your job went away, which for many people, this has become an unfortunate reality. But that is not to say that we don't have work to do. We do. Some of it is paid and some of it is unpaid. But the master has given us work as his servants to do while we wait. But then Jesus goes on to make this comment about the doorkeeper. He says the doorkeeper must stay awake. Now remember, he's talking to Peter, James, John, and Andrew. And many people think the doorkeeper here is referring to Peter. In Matthew 16:19, Jesus told Peter he'd give him the keys of the kingdom. And of course, in this parable, in this text that we read today, verse 35, Jesus goes on to say, you don't know when the master will come, evening, midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning. The rooster crows. We know Peter denied Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed. And of course, we have all these jokes about St. Peter standing at the pearly gates, right? So that should be evidence enough that Peter is the doorkeeper here, right? But regardless, I think these parables are stirring for our imagination. And what I don't want to go too far off the beaten path, but I wonder if there's a sense in which we are not only servants who have been given work to do, but we are also doorkeepers. I mean, what if we, as the disciples of Jesus, are the doorkeepers at the places where we work? That is, what if we're the ones who are commanded to stay awake and alert to Christ in our work? The ones who are there awake and ready to open the door to Christ at our places of work. Not simply in our attitudes, but in our ethics and in the way we care for other employees and the way that we embody our identity as an employee in that space. And not just the places where we get paid, again, but in all the places where we work. So Advent Week 1, preparedness item. You already have it. It's a set of keys. It's a set of keys. We all have a set of keys, and thus we are all, in a sense, doorkeepers. These keys don't just represent doors, they represent the spaces which God has entrusted to us to do his work and also open the door for him to work in the lives of other people. So on my key ring, this is a key to my SUV, my Honda Pilot that I drive around. It represents the places that I go and don't go, and the people I visit and see, and the people I don't visit or see. It's a place where I go to travel, a place where I shop and make purchases. It represents time with family and trips that we take. It represents this little space where I may worship or listen to other kinds of music or podcasts. But I also have a key here to the church office. And that key represents the space that God has given me during this time of my life as a pastor here at Bridge Christian Church. It represents the space of ministry that he's entrusted to me, to you all, and to others in our community. Of course, I also have a key to my house. And this key to my house represents the work that I do at my house and for the people that are in that house. The work that is done with those people in my attitudes and in my actions and how I care for them and how I love them or refrain from doing that in the ways that I need to. And of course, we live in a technological world. Of course, I misplaced my phone. My phone's recording. But we in a technological world, right? We have these phones, and when you hit the button on your phone, right, you have a passcode that you have to enter. And that phone represents the space in which you talk to people, in which you text people, in which you search for things and research things and purchase things. And so it too is a space. Likewise, our computers the things that we search for and purchase and talk and write emails. And for me, I know it's preparing messages and doing study. And it also even represents things that we might watch on those computers. God has given us these keys because we are to work in these spaces that he's given us to steward. We are doorkeepers into those spaces, bringing Christ into them. You all, we all have work to do as disciples of Jesus. And he has put us at these times and these places, in these spaces, to stay awake and to stay alert to what he's doing, his presence, and bringing that alertness and awakening to those places. So may we be Advent preppers who are doorkeepers that are awake and alert to the presence of God, but those also who open up new possibilities for others. We are all essential workers while we wait for his advent.